Marcus Chen is a soldier who learned the zombie outbreak as part of a deliberate culling of the human population. Through Phase 1 of the plan, the intelligent infected designed to create a new world order led by elitists. After discovering top-secret research documents which reveals the truth about the virus, Marcus escapes during a military cleanup operation and becomes involved in groups of survivors who are trying to create a resistance to fight back against both the growing number of zombies and the people behind the conspiracy. Marcus Chen had seen enough death for 10 lifetimes, but nothing like this. The radio buzzed with static as he shifted position beside the overturned Humvee, as he watched the shadows become shambling figures through the mist blowing in from the Pacific. They were calling it a localized outbreak 3 days ago. From 2 days ago, they upgraded that to a regional emergency. They stopped making announcements yesterday or today. He peered through the scope of his M4 carbine and inched back to observe the move of the undead, their characteristic jerky gait that had started to become sickeningly familiar to his eyes. Headshots, or worse headshots. That was what the hastily disseminated field manual had stated prior to the blackout of communications. Marcus knew every word of that manual by heart, but it felt useless now. Like trying to halt a tsunami with a beach umbrella. The morning sun was slicing through the California haze, casting light onto what remained of downtown Sacramento. Cars remained abandoned in the middle of intersections, doors flapping open like broken wings. Windows were broken, stores were looted, and the acrid odor of burning lingered in the air. But it was the silence that really rattled him. No car horns, no sirens, no human voices. Nothing but the occasional moan from the infected and the distant sound of his own breath. Marcus was based at Travis Air Force Base when the first reports came in. A mysterious disease spreading in homeless camps along the Sacramento River, biting, attacking anyone who came close, aggressive to an unusual degree. Victims. The CDC had been brought in, then the National Guard, and, finally, the military. By the time Marcus and his men approached, the incident had already escalated out of control. His squad leader, Staff Sergeant Patricia Wells, was a 20-year veteran who'd seen combat in 3 wars. During those first chaotic hours, she had managed to keep them calm, as the reports grew ever stranger. People dying and then not dying, bite victims turning within hours. Normal crowd control techniques were unavailing against painless, fearless foes. Marcus could remember exactly the moment everything changed. They'd been in the process of escorting a group of civilians to an evac point when Wells had gotten bitten on the forearm. She had kept fighting, kept leading, kept saying she was all right. Right up until she wasn't. It was terrible to see that change happen. The woman who had been barking orders and organizing their defense suddenly turned into something else entirely, and it had been Marcus who had pulled the trigger. He still could see her eyes in the end, still human enough to know what was happening to her. That was 18 hours ago. Since that time, Marcus had been wandering the streets alone, under his most recent command, make his way to UC Davis topside research facility and attempt to extract survivors. The facility had been doing classified work on something, and the outbreak happened. An explanation of what was happening and, more important, how to stop it. There were a bunch of zombies in front of him. Pushing onward in a shaggy pack is 15 or so zombies. A few were still dressed in the tatters of their old lives. A woman in bloody nurse's clothes, a man in a shredded business suit, a high school student whose high school letterman's jacket was hardly recognizable, covered in the blood. Marcus had learned to look beyond the horror, to think of them as an objective rather than as people of the past. It was just about all there was left to hold on to stay sane. He took aim for the first shot, exhaling slowly as he had been taught. The bullet hit home, and the nurse slipped to the asphalt. The report of the gunshot reverberated around the buildings, and some of the other zombies in the area swiveled towards his position. Marcus methodically worked to make one shot at a time, saving bullets, while being the second state of balance to steer clear of motion. He had been trained never to get boxed in, always to have an escape plan by the time he had made it into the next field. Despite the cool morning air, he was wet with sweat. He checked his ammunition, 2 magazines in his pocket, and the one in his gun 45 rounds total. It would have to last them to the university, because there was to be no resupply, no backup, no cavalry swooping in to the rescue. Marcus slunk down unused streets, keeping a wary eye on the shadows and darting between wrecked cars to stay hidden and out of the infected's favor. The city was like a grave, and he was the only thing living, moving about it. An enemy could be lurking in any shadow. Every sound could signal danger. He had been walking for close to an hour when he heard something that stopped him in his tracks. Voices, human voices, brought from a boarded-up coffee shop 2 blocks ahead. Marcus felt his heart race. Not another living person had he heard speak since the death of Wells. The isolation had been gnawing on him, causing him to question if he was the only one left in this nightmarish world. Drawing near, he could hear at least 3 separate voices. 2 men and a woman shouting about something. The closer he crept, the more distinct their words. They were asking each other whether it might be safe enough to leave their shelter. They were discussing whether they could make a run for the evacuation zones that the emergency broadcasts had announced. Marcus already knew. Those evacuation zones did not exist anymore. He had witnessed the overrun checkpoints, the deserted military positions. He could not, however, force himself to confront the survivors face to face. What if one of them had been infected? What if he lured the attention of the undead? He'd seen a safe position turn into a death trap in no time. Instead, he figured that he would watch from afar, to ensure that they were not, in fact, infected before getting close. It was a choice that would torment him to the end of his days. And as Marcus looked out of the coffee shop's windows, he witnessed something that sent shivers down his spine. One of the men, a bulky man in a flannel shirt, was moving differently than the others. His movements were too staccato, too programmed, and his eyes, even at this distance, had a glassy look that Marcus had learned to identify. The infection was early yet, but it was there. The man was moving toward it, and he didn't even yet know it. Marcus had seen this before, how the virus progressed through the body, progressively shutting down his brain while keeping his body moving. A few changed within hours of being bitten, others took days, but they all turned eventually. Marcus lifted his rifle, took aim at the infected man, but his finger hovered over the trigger. Their man was still talking, and speaking what seemed to be normal things. A woman to his left was giggling at something he'd said. They were caught off guard. That was all it took. That moment of hesitation. The man with the fever pounced at the woman, all of the Sudan, and his movements were predatory and non-human. She screamed, and that scream sliced the morning air. The other man attempted to step in, but the now-turned zombie was already chomping, already infecting. Marcus acted on impulse and fired 3 shots through a coffee shop window. The man the infected man had pounced on fell, but the deed had been done. Blood was flowing from the woman's neck, and the other man was trying to help her, he said, not knowing that he was now too late. Now they were both doomed, and Marcus knew it. He desired to assist them, to shout into the void some form of solace or guidance, but coming close to them would only get him shot. He rocked back instead and walked on toward the university, their laughter fading behind him. He reminded himself that he had done what he could, but the guilt lay in his belly like a stone. The UC Davis Center was a further mile away, and the streets were becoming increasingly unsafe. The infection appeared to be spreading faster here. The site of the original outbreak, Marcus kept running into groups of zombies every few blocks and either had to waste ammo or waste time finding a way around. Even his shoulders hurt from the rucksack, and his throat was parched from having to breathe through his mouth in order to avoid the miasma of corruption that hung over everything. When he finally arrived at the university, Marcus was shocked by how ordinary it appeared. The gates remained closed, and no damage was immediately apparent. No shattered windows, no evidence of force. It was as if the center had been deserted and not overwhelmed. He spotted a section of fence that had been cut open, most likely by other survivors seeking to flee, and slipped through. The campus was eerily quiet. Marcus made into a building after building and inspected them meticulously one by one. Most were abandoned, but he saw evidence of a frantic departure. Computers still on, coffee cups on desks, personal effects on the floor. Whatever occurred, here it came on quickly. The facility was in the basement of the main science building, protected by a series of security doors. Marcus thought they would be locked, but they were open. Emergency lighting bathed everything in a sickly yellow, and the air reeked like it was laced with chemicals that made the corner of his eyes sting. He came across the first body in the main laboratory. Dr. Amanda Foster. Read the name tag on her lab coat. She had been shot in the back of the head, execution style, not bitten, not turned, straight up killed. Marcus felt a cold shiver run down his back. But someone had come here before him, someone who had systematically wiped out the research personnel. The next room contained 2 more bodies, each also a researcher, each also shot. Marcus was beginning to realize he wasn't dealing with a zombie apocalypse after all. Somebody had wanted to ensure that the research team couldn't spread the word about what they had learned. But why? What had they discovered worth killing for? He got his answer in Dr. Foster's office. Her computer was on, showing a document that chilled Marcus to the bone. The outbreak wasn't natural. It wasn't some random mutation or bioweapon developed by a rival state. I went in there intentionally and in control, and most terrifying of all, it was just the beginning. Their research notes said the current strain of the virus was essentially a testing run, an opportunity to learn about how the infection would propagate, how society would react, and how quickly containment would break down. The zombies he had been battling had not been the end game. They were only the beginning. The actual horror was described in clinical detail over a dozen of pages. The current bug was actually designed to tear across the population so fast that society didn't have time to adjust and correct, he says, but it also had an automatic constraint. Those infected would eventually weaken, wither, and expire, leaving a sick but living population. Phase 1 was about thinning the herd and testing response measures. Phase 2 would be different, and the next strain would be smarter, stronger, and damn near impossible to kill. Instead of none-thinking zombies, it would generate something much worse. They were afflicted, but not dumb zombies apathetically lumbering around, not in a bad way, infected. People who kept their smarts, their memories, and their strategizing and planning abilities. They'd be stronger than humans, faster than humans, and completely without conscience or empathy. Marcus's hands trembled as he skimmed the contents. The virus for Phase 2 already existed and was already in use in a number of test locations around the world. As governments fought to control the outbreak, the threat grew out of hand as it was transmitted through the water supply, the food chain, and even the air. No one would know what hit them until it was too late. The document also had a map of deployment sites. Most of the largest cities in North America, Europe, and Asia were already infected with Phase 2. People were walking around, going about their business, not knowing that the seeds of humanity's destruction rode along with them, and the virus was programmed to stay dormant for weeks, even months, before it was set to activate. If they did, the infected wouldn't look as they do, moving at a shuffle with a groan. They would stalk with intent, organize attacks, and have no pity. Marcus opened several more files, uncovering the conspiracy to unleash the outbreak. It wasn't foreign terrorists or mad scientists. It was an orchestrated plan by the powerful and wealthy who felt that mankind had become too numerous, too wasteful, and too destructive. They pictured themselves as gardeners, trimming the overripe population back to create a more manageable world. The files named names, politicians, military officers, CEOs, even some humanitarian groups, all of them involved in a conspiracy that would have murdered billions of people to save the planet. They had research facilities, private armies, and sanctuaries ready for the aftermath. As the world burned, they'd hole up in those luxury bunkers until the population was reduced to the size they considered proper. But the most stomach-churning surprise was saved for last. The Phase 2 infected wouldn't just be people randomly victimized by a virus. They would be hand-picked men, selected on the basis of their intelligence, their abilities, and their readiness to obey orders. Scientists, engineers, doctors, soldiers, exactly who society would need to start over. They would be a new ruling caste, superhuman in power, and utterly loyal to those who had wrought them. Suddenly, Marcus saw this blueprint for the end of human civilization as he knew it. Not nuclear war, not climate change, but biological warfare intended to create a new world order. The zombies outside were nothing more than a red herring, a device to keep everyone's attention on the immediate danger while the true threat moved. Silently through the population, he transferred the files to a portable drive, figuring that this information had to get to someone who could act on it, but who? The chain of command in the military was broken. All government officials were either dead or complicit in the plot. The media had vanished, the internet was out, and much of the population was either infected or had fled in fear. Marcus heard footsteps out in the hall, in front of the office, a bunch of individuals walking briskly rather than the lurching shuffle of zombies. He reached for his rifle and ducked behind the desk, his heart racing. The research facility was supposed to be vacant. If anyone else was present, they were not present to help. They were getting closer, and Marcus could make out snippets of conversation, army radio etiquette, synchronized movements, professional jargon. But they weren't rescue operations. They were discussing cleanup and containment, except for ensuring that no evidence was left behind. He was watching the cover-up in progress. Marcus knew the same folks who had killed the research team were here to clean up the facility and eliminate any evidence of the plot. If they got to him, he'd vanish, like Dr. Foster and all her peers. The truth would die with him. He had to escape. But The hallway was the only way out. Marcus's gaze swept the office looking for options. There was a vent grate in the ceiling that seemed like a good option, but it would be noisy to get to. A window, except it was too little and pointed the wrong way. His options were narrowing, and time was running out. They were outside now. The voices, Marcus could hear them clearing rooms, working through the building in methodical fashion. They would be professional soldiers, most likely members of some kind of special forces, who were told to kill everyone who knew. He was only minutes ahead of them to the office. Marcus took an action that flew in the face of all his instincts. Rather than attempting to hide or flee, he took up a position to attack. These were people who were in on the conspiracy, who were culpable for the deaths of millions. They had it coming to them, and, even better, putting them down might delay the ambush long enough for him to get word out. Marcus was waiting when the first soldier stepped into the office. The man was in full tactical gear, but Marcus had an edge, position, and surprise. His knife slipped into the seam between the soldier's helmet and his body armor, and the man went down without a catch of breath. Marcus took the soldier's radio and weapon and then braced himself for the others. The other Levatera was more cautious. He called out to his companion before he went in. Marcus tossed the first man's helmet in the hall, drawing attention. As the second soldier approached to see what it was, Marcus shot him twice in the chest. The body armor had taken most of the impact, but the force of it sent the man reeling back into the wall. Marcus was just starting to move in to take him out, when he heard the soldier talking on his radio. "Contact, we are in touch with a facility. Unknown number of hostiles, requesting immediate backup." The call resonated instantly and chillingly. "Copy that. Initiating building lockdown. Nobody gets out alive." Marcus listened to the clicks of electronic locks going off through the base. Emergency lights turned red, and a ventilation system started releasing something into the air that smelled like almonds. They were planning to gas the building, kill everyone inside, and then say it was to prevent the outbreak. He had to move fast. In his pocket, the portable drive with the research files remained, but it would be useless if he were to die in this place. Marcus lifted the gas mask and equipment off the dead soldier, and ran for the nearest exit. There was gas of some kind filling the stairwell, and he could hear more soldiers moving through the building. The main entrance was locked. But Marcus knew there was a service tunnel that led to the steam plant. It was dangerous, but it could be his only opportunity. He ran through the basement, led by emergency lighting and trying to outpace the gas. His lungs ached and his eyes were tearing. The tunnel was narrow and crowded with pipes, but it ran out of the main building. Marcus crawled through, pulling his gear behind him. Behind him, he heard explosions as the soldiers threw grenades to clear rooms. They weren't taking any chances. Marcus emerged from the tunnel to find himself in an entirely new building. No one was inside the chemistry lab, but he could see vehicles outside the main building. Military trucks, hazmat teams, and what appeared to be a news crew assembling equipment. They were already organizing the cover story, ready to tell the world that the research center had been destroyed to avoid the spread of infection. Marcus knew he had to hit the road before they broadened the search. The portable drive was heavy in his pocket, the weight of humanity's future pressing on his heart. But where could he go? Who could he trust? The conspiracy was up to the highest levels of both government and military. Traditional channels were compromised. He thought about the survivors he'd seen in the coffee shop, the ones he'd been unable to save. They were something the conspirators hadn't bet on. Innocent people, no more a part of their grand plan than these people here, just trying to survive. Maybe that was the answer. Perhaps there would be resistance, not from the top down to the bottom up. Marcus wandered across the campus, away from the main roads that the cleanup crews plied. He heard helicopters above him, their searchlights slicing through the early morning mist. Gunfire was soon heard coming from the main compound, then the unmistakable rush of flamethrowers. They were being thorough. As he neared the perimeter of the campus, Marcus came upon something that made him stop. There was a formation of zombies, not a disorganized mob, but an organized, purpose-driven march. They were going straight for the base, attracted by the sound and motion, but their action was too formal, too cunning. Marcus recognized he was seeing the shift he had read about in the research files. They weren't the vacant, slow-veering zombies from the early days of the outbreak. These were Phase 2 units with intelligence and strategy intact. They were stalking the cleanup crews, lured by some instinct or programming that caused them to seek out anyone tied to the conspiracy. The implications were staggering. If the Phase 2 infected were already on the move, if they were intent on specific targets, then the clock had sped up. The conspiracy was spinning out of control of its own making. The perfect thigh-high apocalypse they had engineered was starting to look like something else. Marcus observed the advanced zombies close in on a military jeep. Instead of launching a direct assault, they appeared to be examining it, absorbing the lessons. One of these sniffed a discarded weapon and seemed to examine the object with intelligence. Another instinctively went to work at one of the vehicles, doors not flailing at it at random but methodically stripping away its weak spots. When they finally did attack, they were devastatingly effective. The troops in the vehicle barely had time to respond before the zombies had smothered their guns and smelted them to the bone. But these weren't feeding attacks. The zombies appeared to be focusing on the soldiers' equipment and communication devices rather than human flesh. Marcus understood that he was watching the origins of a new type of creature. The infected of Phase 2 weren't only smarter zombies. They were changing, adjusting, becoming something completely different. And according to the research files, they were only the beginning. Every generation would be smarter, more competent, more threatening than the one before. He needed to share this information. But first, he had to live. The cleanup teams were meeting the superior undead, and they'd been turning campus into a war zone. Marcus could hear the rattle of automatic weapons fire, interspersed by screams he realized were definitely human ones. The hunters had become the hunted. En route to the city, Marcus skirted the highways and the military columns and the packs of zombies. The contents of the portable drive felt like a hot coal in his pocket. It held the truth about the contagion, the conspiracy behind the disaster, and the horrifying future that could befall humanity. _blank space 6 end quote. Iterator 0 true endement 0. But knowledge without doing was of no value. He had to figure out how to get the information broadcast out to the people who could act on it. But the established media was done, the internet was over, and the government had been taken. Marcus understood that he needed to create his own network, to locate other survivors who could spread the truth. The city was now a different place, a more menacing one. The zombies were becoming more organized, working in bigger groups. Marcus witnessed one team using vehicles as barricades, while another laid an apparent perimeter around one building. They were learning, figuring out, growing into something more than mere mindless predators. But there were also indications that human resistance persisted. Smoke signals from the rooftops, graffiti communications on walls, coordinated barricades. In strategic locations, the survivors were rallying, pushing back against the zombies, as well as the military units being sent to protect them. Marcus observed that he wasn't the only one dubious of the official account. Others had seen the inconsistencies, the rapid spread of the outbreak that was too fast to be natural, the military response that looked like it was meant to fail. They were constructing their own networks, exchanging information, getting ready for a longer fight. He decided to touch base with one of the survivor groups. It was an enormous risk, but the alternative would be to sit isolated on information that might save lives. Marcus made his way to an apartment building that had barriers he'd observed arranged for coordinated defensive positions. The guards were awake, armored and regularly organized as he called out to them, telling them he was a soldier who had vital information. Their response came quick and wary. They asked for evidence of his identity, confirmation of the story he was telling, and guarantees that he was not infected. Marcus understood their caution. Trust was in short supply that they could ill afford that the leader of the group was a woman. Captain Jennifer Hayes, a former military police officer who had been in the city when the outbreak started. She'd assembled survivors from across all walks of life, established a defensive position, and was attempting to make contact with other resistance groups. When Marcus presented her with the research files, she went from suspicion to horror. "This is going to change everything," she said, scrolling through the documents. "We've been fighting the wrong enemy. The zombies are the RDO doves." Marcus nodded, the burden returned off his shoulders. Ah, at last, a man who recognized the breadth of the danger. Captain Hayes ordered her people into action at once, ready to spread the word to other survivors. But she also raised an unsettling point. If it's true, if the Phase 2 infected have already been activated, then we're not just struggling to survive anymore. We're fighting for the future of a civilized human society. And we're already behind. The following hours were a whirl of action. Marcus and his team helped Hayes and her colleagues turn their defenses and communications with other survivor groups into a city-spanning network of research files and shared defensive strategies. They discovered the situation was worse than they had thought. Phase 2 infected had been sighted in several cities and they were exhibiting higher or behavior. But they also discovered the conspiracy wasn't as invincible as it seemed. The speeded-up schedule was generating headaches. The Phase 2 malignant had mutated beyond their master's control, preying on survivors and conspirators with equal savagery. The orchestrated Armageddon was descending into a 3-4-all. Marcus played the part of a military liaison, helping the groups of survivors contain what they were up against. The classic zombie-slaying strategies were useless when it came to the Phase 2 infected. These were enemies that called for planning, cooperation, and above all, brains. The war for the future of humanity would no longer be waged by brute force, but by information and adaptation. Evening descended, decimating the city. Marcus' arms folded across his chest at the apartment rooftop overlooking the carnage. In the distance fires raged, and the rattle of small arms fire filled the space between the buildings. But there were also glimmers of hope. Lights in windows, signals exchanged by survivor groups, the burgeoning underground of resistance fighters who would not give up. The research files, it turns out, disclosed how real the threat to humanity was. Zombie apocalypse was the very least of it, a precursor to a nightmare of far greater proportions. But they had also exposed vulnerabilities in the conspiracy, signs that their perfect plan was already going wrong. The infected in Phase 2 were running rampant, and survivors were turning out to be more of a challenge than anticipated, and Marcus knew the next stage of the war would not be the same. There would be no question of containing an outbreak or evacuating civilians. It would be about adaptation, evolution, and the base question of what it was to be human in a universe in which no longer was humanity the dominant species. The pocket Portapack drive held more than information. It was the template of resistance, the know-how required to stop their conspiracy and their products. Now, most of all, it contained hope. The evidence that even when things were at their darkest, there were still people who were prepared to stand up for what was right. As Marcus geared up for the long night ahead, he thought about Sergeant Wells, as well as the other soldiers who had lost their lives in the initial phase of the outbreak. They had fought courageously against an enemy they didn't comprehend, under orders that were doomed. Their deaths would not be in vain. The truth would live on, and the chance of a future worth fighting for. The zombie plague had only just begun, but this was the place, and now was the time when humankind fought back, not as passive casualties in somebody else's plan, but as active agents in deciding their own destiny. The war for the future was on, and Marcus Chen was no longer merely a soldier doing as he was told. He was a keeper of truth, a defender of hope, a sign that humanity would not go down without a fight. The undead were merely the initial act, yet so was the resistance, and in the very dark of the craziest world, that was everything.